Welcome to today's tutorial on the capabilities of Compumetics NeuroScan's MicroMagLink system, as well as the associated software, the Curie Neuroimaging Suite. Today we will highlight the features of both online and offline artifact suppression, including gradient artifact and ballistocardiogram. For the purposes of this demonstration, we will run the software in simulator mode, in essence recreating a live recording. The data set that we will be using today was recorded in a 3 Tesla GE magnet, and I'm simply hiding some channels right now that aren't necessary for our demonstration. And in this particular case, as in all cases with the MicroMagLink system, we synchronize the clock of the Synapse RT amplifier to the clock of the scanner. The gradient artifact has just begun, so we can begin our online suppression of artifact. With the Curie software, we always move from top to bottom down the menu list as part of our data processing or data analysis, data acquisition sequence. In this particular case, however, I can go directly to artifact reduction. The method we will choose is based on event codes. That is, these event 5s shown up here at the top, which are the onset of each TR in the scan. The numbers shown here, which are 5s, indicate the value that we have applied to these TR onsets, and we simply set the interval, which in this case is a 2000 millisecond TR, which starting at data point or time point 0 extends out to time point 1999 milliseconds. We will use the so-called Allen method or subtraction technique. Oh, and pardon me for a moment. I'm moving back to my other window here. So let's go back to event codes. Event 5, 0 to 599. And we select the number of averages that we want is 10. And we begin the subtraction. We can see the number of events being added in the filter add up, and as that happens we can see the data start to get, the artifacts start to become increasingly more suppressed. And we'll give it a moment until that is complete. While we are waiting for that to complete, let me point out some advanced features here. Number one, we have chosen to suppress the unfiltered data. This data is sampled at 1000 Hertz, therefore the passband is DC to 200 Hertz. We're including other channels, including EKG, so we can get correction on that EKG channel as well, because it's also affected by the gradient artifact. Subsample correction, which is not selected here, allows us to upsample the data to 50 kilohertz to suppress the gradient artifact should there be some additional degree of jitter that's not adequately treated by the standard subtraction method. Thus far, we have not found an example with the MicroMagLink system of a case where this upsampling of the data is required. We also have a detrending function, and this can be applied in cases of live recordings or online corrections when there may be slight temporal inconsistencies in the TRs. So here we can see we get a very good correction of the gradient, suppression of the gradient artifact, and I'll just scale it up a bit, but we can also see very clearly the ballistocardiogram artifact through this data. So we will move to the second step in our processing sequence for artifact suppression. The first one is suppression of the gradient artifact. The second step we will do is suppression of the ballistocardiogram artifact based on triggering off of the EKG signal. Now typically with your system, with a MicroMagLink system, we can include a pulse oximeter. Pulse oximeter is placed on the signal, slightly different timing, but since it's a fiber optic connection to the control room, it is essentially transparent to the magnetic field and gives us a very, very clean and consistent measure of triggering for the ballistocardiogram suppression. However, we can use the EKG signal. And I'm not going to do much correction to the EKG signal. We'll switch here to our threshold measurement, which is what we want to use. I've already pre-selected EKG, but if we click on the channel selector, we can select any channel. We just come to EKG and turn it on. We switch our interval from minus 300 to 400 milliseconds. And we start to get a nice consistent pattern of picking out the artifact. And in this particular case, we're actually triggering mostly off of the distorted T wave in the EKG signal. We have a couple changes I will make. First, I like to use my threshold measurement to detect the first slope in the artifact. So we'll let it do that. And if that doesn't give us clear, consistent intervals for the gradient artifact, or pardon me, for the ballistocardiogram artifact, we can alternatively switch to peak. And in this particular case, since I'm not doing any filtering at all, we'll leave it on peak. The approach that we're going to apply in this particular case is a PCA method. So we'll turn the algorithm on, initiate it, and I'm going to switch it off for one moment. We'll switch it back on, and we can advance up here, and we are now getting a very, very clean and clear suppression of the ballistocardiogram artifact. I'm using 3 components, and here we've just switched from a situation where we've gone from eyes open into an eyes closed state where we can see very, very clear alpha. And a nice suppression of the BCG artifact as well for online. When we are in the second stage of artifact suppression, again, we must be careful how many components we apply for the PCA analysis. If we move it up to 5 components, yes, we will get a better suppression of the BCG, but what you can also see is we start to suppress our signal of interest, which is alpha. Typically, with the ballistocardiogram artifact, 2 or 3 components are consistent, are sufficient to get a good BCG suppression. Sometimes we need to go to 3 components to correct those mastoid channels, which have a tendency to be a little higher in their level of BCG artifact. Once again, I just want to reiterate that this is a DC to 200 Hertz recording. This little interval of loss of suppression is due to the fact that in the middle of this data file we had one TR that was 1,999 milliseconds in length and not 2,000 milliseconds. The suppression fails momentarily but then corrects itself, as you can see. The last feature I'd like to show you is filtering of the data. As I mentioned previously, we are not filtering the data at this point in time. However, we can turn filtering off to some kind of a user-defined interval. In this case, this is DC to 70 Hertz. I'm going to shut off the high-pass filter because particularly when we're doing an eyes open, eyes closed analysis, we want to see these sweeps in the data that indicate there's a state change. And we have our low-pass filter set at 70 Hertz. We can change that to 100 Hertz. And we can see that we still have very clear and consistent data. Next, we will illustrate offline suppression. We're now going to illustrate the characteristics of the offline gradient suppression as well as offline ballistocardiogram suppression. When we are doing our artifact suppression offline, we have a few more options that are available to us. First, when we are doing suppression of the gradient artifact, number one, I have found that if we do a combined method of PCA first plus gradient artifact, or pardon me, plus the traditional Allen method of subtraction second, we can get even in a cleaner removal of the gradient artifact, or cleaner suppression of the gradient artifact, than we do simply using the Allen method alone. And I will go through and walk through these steps right now. So once again, in our signal processing functional data menu, the only parameter I have set thus far is a baseline correction for the data. So I've simply corrected it so each of the channels for visual purposes is settled in its own display area. Next, we will go back to using event codes for our BCG suppression. If we come down to our list, it will give us a list of all possible event codes, which we know are TRs indicated by event 5, and there are a total of 237 in total. Our interval is either 0 to 2000 milliseconds or 0 to 1999. I'm going to leave it from 0 to 2000 for now, just to show you that there's some flexibility in how these can be applied. So we have our interval set from 0 to 2000 milliseconds. In this case, I'm going to apply a PCA method to take off the largest peaks in the artifact. So we'll turn that on, and we are going to apply it globally to the data. So what I'm going to show you is each step of the process done separately to begin with, and then we will combine all the steps together. So we'll scan the data, which simply means it goes through and reads all of the data into memory. This is an important feature of the Curie software, is we do most of the processing as in-memory transformations. That means we load the data into memory, and then when we apply our corrections, they are shown instantaneously. Right now it's actually rolling through the data 3 times because I've basically done some initial setup of the algorithms, but this will give you an idea of the steps that we go through. Okay, so the first correction step has been applied. If we want, we can look at the PCA components that we have rejected or identified. So those are shown right here, all 5 PCA components that we can look at. If we want to stack those components and separate them out a bit, we can do that. It's a right click and stack waveforms. And we can scale them down a little bit, and we can see the size and amplitude of those components as we move through the data. Clearly though, these are fairly distinguishable and consistent, certainly the first 4 components and the 5th as well from working with this data, are all related to the gradient artifact. I'm going to close that window. Now we're going to move to step 2, which is, in this particular case, using event codes again to suppress the gradient artifact, but this time we are going to use the Allen method. So PCA first, Allen method second. Offline, we can increase the number of events that go into the average because they are distributed around the epoch to be corrected. When we're online, all of the events that are used to correct the artifact occur prior to the event of correction. But when we're offline, we can the algorithm switches slightly. So for example, in this particular case where we have 15 averages going into the correction, half of those are from before the time of the event that is to be corrected, and half are from the time after, since we have all of this now available to us. So again, we can go through and scan the data at this point. We can see our 5 markers up here. So very clearly we're getting the gradient artifact suppressed. And again, we have that little interval in the middle where we lose the suppression. But let's walk into the data a little bit. So that's the warm-up of the algorithms. And then we walk into the data, and there's the suppression of the gradient artifact using these 2 combined methods, PCA and the standard Allen method. The next step that we want to do is to suppress the ballistic cardiogram artifact. I've done a little pre-processing on the EKG channel here by selectively filtering it. So let's go to filter frequencies. And in essence, in a user-defined case, I've gone from 1 to 10 hertz to stabilize it. So we can turn this on. And now, when we are on step 3, we will come to the threshold method again. Select my EKG channel, and I'm just going to go through the process of showing you. There's EKG. It was VEOG. We could click that, but EKG is obviously what we want to use. And set our thresholds. I'm going to turn on both threshold markers so you can see what happens. In fact, that's a little difficult to see, so let's make that let's make it 200. There. So when we have both of these threshold markers activated, we get two horizontal broken lines. So fundamentally a positive and a negative threshold marker that we can use. I'm going to put it to 0 to turn off the one marker. Negative is up in this particular case. And then I'm going to set up my other parameters. Again, using unfiltered data. I do not want to use the peak in this case because I filtered my EKG signal on the remnants of what looks like EKG to highlight again that distorted T wave. And I want to work off of the first slope of the T wave. I find that gives me more regular intervals between each of my each of my EKG events. So we can see the peak of the measurement that we're getting from our EKG signal, and then just slightly lagged behind it is our major event or major marker of the ballistocardiogram. Again, I'm going to use principal components analysis in this case. We're going to apply it globally and locally, or pardon me, globally as opposed to locally, because we want to have a continuous correction of the artifact, and then simply tell it to scan the data once again. The correction is applied automatically, and we can see that compared to not having the reduction algorithm applied versus having it applied, we get a very nice correction using 3 components. We'll go to 2, to 1, and back to 0. Clearly that first component takes care of the large peaks of the ballistocardiogram artifact, but we can still see regular repetitions of artifact through the data. We go to the second component, still a little bit of residual, and then we suppress the third component, and there we can see a nice clear suppression of the artifact. And here's a nice step function where we go from a case of eyes open into eyes closed. We get a little bit of alpha beforehand. Our poor subject was rather sleepy that day, but we can see the clear step from eyes open into an eyes closed state. Now once again, no filtering has been applied to this data. We can move into the display of the filtering. We can turn on filtering if we like. There's 1 to 70 hertz. I'll turn the high pass filtering off, and there is DC to 70 hertz, DC to 100 hertz. Very quickly then, this is our demonstration of the capabilities of the MicroMagLink system with respect to gradient suppression and ballistocardiogram suppression, both online and offline. The data was sampled at 1 kilohertz in a GE3T scanner, and the clock of our Synapse RT amplifier was synced to the clock of the GE3T scanner. Thank you for your attention this afternoon.